So good evening, everyone. We're so excited to have you here today with Dr. Ami Popat-Jain, and we are going to be talking about mental health as we have been for the last 4 weeks. Again, this is BIPOC Mental Health Awareness Month, an honor that was started by Bebe Campbell Moore, an African-American novelist who really wanted to elevate conversations about mental health in our communities. So we're really grateful for her and her work. A lot of her novels focus on mental health issues. So today I'm just going to do a brief introduction as we usually do for InnoPsych for those who are new to us. I'm Charmain Jackman. I am the founder and CEO of InnoPsych Inc., an organization that's on a mission to disrupt racial disparities in mental health. We have a national therapist of color directory that features beautiful, smart therapists of color like Dr. Popat-Jain, who's here with us today, Popat-Jain, who's here with us today. And we're always looking for new therapists to join our network. We have a very aggressive therapist of color recruitment campaign, and we're looking to bring on new therapists, 2021 therapists of color into our network this year. Yes, it's a very ambitious goal, but we know that the therapists are out there. And we want to make sure that people have access to the services they need. We have gotten so many requests for therapists. I know Shauna can testify that she collects the data. She's doing the behind the scenes work. And we're getting lots of requests, but we're really excited to see a lot of therapists also join our network. So if you're looking for a therapist, please join our network, and Shauna will share those links with us in a few minutes. We also feature, in addition to having conversations like this, our goal is to really make the conversation about mental health be normal, right? There's so much stigma and baggage around mental health and therapy in our communities. And the reason that we started Thrive on Thursdays was really to deconstruct those conversations, raise the visibility of therapists of color in our communities. Many of us are in the office doing the work, so we really have time to come out and do that public facing work. And so I created that platform to be able to do this. So thank you so much for being here. And in addition, we also have lots of wonderful products. I'm so excited. I created a card deck last year because I saw the demand for emotional health and healing services really skyrocket. And I knew that people were going to be on waiting lists for therapists. So we have a card deck that we started that I created last year. We have journals. I believe in the power of journaling and really encourage people to journal. We have a number of t-shirts and mugs with the theme of thriving looks like this. So we want to showcase our communities to thrive and provide resources in addition to therapy to help with that thriving. And we have a special code for you, Hello15, and that gives you 15% off of our products. So that is my little advertisement. I really feel it's helpful for you to hear a little bit about InnoPsych and what our mission is. So thank you for being here. And we're going to get this conversation started. So welcome, Dr. Popat-Jain. I'm so excited to have you. We've had a number of conversations about many different things. So one of the first questions I always ask my guests is, tell us a little bit about what got you into the mental health field, into psychology, and specifically, I know you're a psychologist. Many of us come from cultures that really speak negatively about mental health. There's a lot of stigma around it. So I'm always really interested in hearing people's journeys. Like, how did you overcome that? You know, if those were the values or the narratives in your culture, how did you overcome those and get into this field?
Yeah, no, that's such an important and interesting question. It certainly was a journey for me. I think, at the age of 12 years old, I thought, hey, I'm going to be a pharmacist. And this was a very acceptable career for a young Indian woman to sort of strive to be. And my parents both took great pride in this. And as time went on and I went to college and began taking some of those hard STEM classes, I realized I was very unhappy in sort of the way that I was spending my time in college. And slowly, my advisor sort of said, "Why don't you take a psychology class or two?" And I had this awakening in me, and I just felt like I finally was studying something that was meaningful to me and that made sense. I had a research fellowship, or rather a fellowship, when I was in college. And so I used that to have an experiential learning um, experience where I went and worked at a halfway home with women who were recently released, from incarceration, and were spending time there, and got to sit in counseling sessions and do some shadowing and do some peer support for some of these women. And like, I really just fell in love with that. And very quickly, I decided to apply for my master's in counseling. And going back to the cultural piece, which is so big, I'm sure I disappointed my parents a bit at the beginning to say, like, hey, I think I have found something else. And for them to say, well, what are you going to do with that? What does psychology lead to? We don't quite understand. And there weren't necessarily role models or people around me that I could point to and say, this is what they do, and this is what it looks like. And so it was, at times, felt, very isolating. Eventually completed my master's and at Boston College, and then felt that I didn't feel ready. I wanted more training. I wanted exposure to the research. I knew at some point I wanted to engage in some teaching. So I decided to then go on and do my PhD in counseling psychology. And I think my parents could both be pretty happy with that at this point. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so, thank you for sharing that. I think it's one, I know it can be a personal journey in that, navigating family and expectations and cultural expectations. So thank you for sharing that. But it's not, just about every person who's come on here. I think there was maybe a couple of people whose parents were in the field, but the
Mm,
majority of people who weren't, like, this was not necessarily seen as a career option or a viable career option, and still
exactly.
not. Yeah, right, and still not.
Right.
I've talked to college students and of color and specifically, and they've shared that their family members are, what are you doing? What is that? That doesn't exist, right? So there's still these messages, and
Absolutely.
yeah, and that's why it's so important for us to share our stories, right?
Yeah.
And so people also and to see us be successful in our careers, right? I think that's also the part of it. So thank you for sharing that. Was
Absolutely.
that was tell us a little bit about that conversation initially with, that family disappointment. Like, how did you navigate that conversation?
Right. I think there was this sort of, we understand that some of these classes are hard, but why would you leave a field that has sort of this guaranteed outcome? This
Mhm.
is what you've been working for this whole time. This is why you went to this specific college and went to this specific program. What are you going to do with this? What comes after? What is your life going to look like? And, my dad he's no longer here, but was a very pragmatic person, was an accountant.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
you're doing this, and what's the goal? What's the outcome? What's the hope? And, I kind of said, I'm still trying to figure that out. And I think that
Mhm.
uncertainty was hard for me to tolerate and harder for them to tolerate. Um,
Yeah.
but it
Yeah.
became, I think more recently I've had, great conversations with my family in which they really show their support, and are able to say that they're proud now that they see that I'm doing
Mhm.
something that I really love and am so passionate about.
Yeah. And I think, two things I want to pick up on. It's like you said, right? You said initially there are no models, right? There are no role models for us. And I think for the same for families, like many psychologists, when they're not of color, but also we're often in our offices. So people don't see us, they don't understand what we do. So there's a lot of mystery around that. I think that's one thing for sure. Um, and
And
what was I forget? Go ahead. Yeah.
I didn't know anyone who had been in therapy, growing
Hmm.
up. And as I was
Hmm.
going into this and transitioning
Hmm.
into this, I didn't know anyone personally
Hmm.
who had been in therapy. My parents certainly didn't know people who had been in therapy, because I think, especially in our Indian culture, it's something that is kept, if there's a lot of hesitation around seeking services, there's a lot of stigma in the culture. And then on top of that, if people are then going and seeking services, they're certainly not talking about it.
Right.
And so it was
Right.
hard to put pieces around me and in my community. Um,
Hmm.
But,
Mhm.
growing up, I had a family member who suffered from mental health issues. And, it was heartbreaking and interesting to see the loss of social support he had upon becoming symptomatic with depression and
Mhm.
symptoms of abuse of alcohol. And very quickly, the community didn't know what to do, how to tolerate the person, how to handle them. And so eventually my family member was in isolation.
Mm.
Truly, he was the inspiration for me to then go and further study
Mm.
Asian immigrants and learn a little bit more about the stigma and
Mhm.
significant discomfort around even the phrase mental health
Mhm.
and therapy and work like that.
Yeah. Um, yeah, thank you for sharing that personal history. I think that I shared a few months ago, my mom was actually on the show, and we talked about family members who had experienced mental health crisis. Didn't talk about it that, there's a lot of secrecy, silence, lack of knowledge, right? I mean, you're talking about just lack of knowledge of knowing what to do or how to support this young person. And
Right.
so people just kind of avoid and drift away. But what a beautiful his story as a way for you to be able to come into this field in that way. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think the other thing that you highlighted on that I wanted to touch on too, I think there's a generational difference too in terms of career choice that you talked about your dad being pragmatic, right? It's about you do things. And I think coming from immigrant cultures as well, or experiences, I should say, is that you want to make sure you came here for a reason, right? To be
Oh,
successful, right? And so, right, that is the goal. And so you do what you do to make money, and it's not necessarily about loving your career, right? It's about
about having a
doing
successful future and being able to support yourself and to have a family and to support a family. And then
exactly.
all over again and to sacrifice everything for your children for them to then be able to do the same thing for their own family.
Hmm. Hmm.
Absolutely. They're
Yeah.
definitely voice in the back of my head that my parents immigrated from India, came here to a country they knew very little about in hopes for a better life for the children they didn't even know. And so
Hmm.
that then is a lot of pressure to then take on,
Hmm.
and that certainly wasn't a message that I was hearing directly from my parents, but there's that undertone, there's certainly that undertone. And how do I do something that I love and also have my
Hmm.
parents understand and be proud of that and allow them to see this as sort of a sustainable career and option.
Yeah. 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 So true. I think even if they don't tell you, right, you see the sacrifice and you see the struggle. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. So tell us a little bit about what you do. What is your day to day? What is a day in the life of?
Yeah, so I ended up starting my own practice. I would say right around the new year. I think the pandemic certainly had um, for many of us, changed the way we looked at career, life, balance, all
Mhm.
of those things. And
Mhm.
so, very excitingly, I started my own practice in January. And so, my focus has been working primarily with women, a lot of women of color, talking about lots of issues that come up around anxiety, depression, trauma, and other issues that are culturally relevant. I work with a lot of South Asian women,
Mhm.
and so a lot of my work is meeting with them. Additionally, so depending on the time of year, I've been doing some teaching at Northeastern, and I plan to do some adjunct work again in the fall in their
Mhm.
counseling program. As an alumni, I love to be able to go back and meet with
Mhm.
students and be part of the training. That's always an absolute joy and honor of mine. Um, and I do some consultation work with a couple of organizations, one being a South Asian domestic violence organization, and another being a South Asian worker center organization, where I do different things, whether it's high level consultation, running groups, providing presentations, things like that. So, what's been really exciting about kind of starting my own thing is actually getting to spend time doing the work that I want to do.
Mm.
And that's just brought me so much joy. And, as
Mhm.
a mom, I think it also allows me to be more flexible and use my time more meaningfully.
Mm.
That's great. So you just transitioned in January this year, 2021.
Yeah.
Nice. So you're one of those growing statistics of people who left their jobs to start their own.
I am. I absolutely am. And I don't think I could do anything else because
Mm,
it's so nice. I felt like when I was working in larger organizations, there was so much time spent in a lot of pragmatic meetings, and there was a lot of political kind of
negotiations and yeah.
negotiations. That's the word. A lot of
Mhm,
political negotiations. And now that I'm doing my own work and my own practice, I get to work in line with my own values,
mhm,
the work that I want to do without having to satisfy some sort of statistic, but actually being able to work with a client and work in a way that is meaningful to the relationship and meaningful to the presenting issue at hand.
mhm, mhm. I love what you said, kind of being able to work with your own in align with your own values. I think it's so important. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a long journey to get here. It feels like a lot of hurdles
Mhm,
through. The many years of graduate school, the dissertation, and the licensing exam and applying for license, all of the pieces. And so
mhm.
to sort of be at a place now where things feel like good and like I'm making a difference in a way that I want to feels very
Mhm. Yeah, that's amazing. I'm so excited for you. Some of you know that I do courses to help people make that transition. And it can be such a scary time. And I think some of the things that, because we, in psychology graduate school, we don't get a lot of exposure to business concepts or preparation for starting our own businesses. So it can
yeah.
feel really scary, right? The imposter syndrome kind of rears its head.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah,
Courses similar to yours have been helpful to
yeah.
me figuring out the process and looking into my own personal life. I mean, my husband has certainly is in the business world and has certainly field, fielded more than his fair share of questions and other
And it's here
colleagues.
today, right? He's on the call today. Nice. Thank you, hubby.
Yes, he's right here. I think my daughter's there too, which is lovely. Um, so yes, you're so right when you say that there is no like I haven't taken 7 years of graduate school. I didn't take one business class.
Hmm.
Going and starting
Hmm.
your own practice is certainly it's a large feat. I am very thankful to people such as yourself who really offer structure and guidance around
Hmm.
starting this
Yeah,
work. I sort of wish
yeah.
I crossed a bit sooner in that way.
That's okay. That's it. They're crossing at the exact time they need to be. you know. So let's talk a little bit about some of the clients you work with. And for those listening in, we invite you to pose any questions that you have, any comments um, to either Dr. Popat-Jain or myself as we have our conversation. So one of the other things that we often talk about is, and particularly you share that you work a lot of your practice is with South Asian clients.
Yeah.
And, I often reflect on, I remember being on internship and meeting my first Black family and the elate, and I was going to be working with the child, but when the moms came out, when I came out into the waiting room to pick them up, she saw that, it was this Black woman who's going to see her. She was so excited. I mean, she was so excited. I think she probably screamed and she was just elated to know that this is going to be someone
Mhm.
from our culture who's going to get her to some extent, right? Even though, culturally we have different upbringings in different places. So tell us a little bit about that experience for you when women come and they see you, who's someone who comes from a similar cultural, ethnic
Yeah,
background. What has
absolutely.
that experience been like?
So, I didn't have a ton of opportunity to work with the South Asian population until I started my own practice, because the types of places I was working, there just weren't a lot of people seeking help in those organizations. And so once I came into private practice and my profile was on both enopsych as well as Psychology Today, I noticed, I heard from a lot of South Asian women. And as I started doing sort of some of those early consultations, kind of asking, what are you looking for in therapy? Why did you reach out to me? And oftentimes it was, I really want to work with somebody who gets it. It's very exhausting to sit and have to explain lots of cultural nuances that people either don't understand. Other therapists in the past either haven't understood, or maybe have said, you need to do things differently without taking into account what the cultural expectations are. And so I think a lot of the women I work with feel a sense of, it's just easier. It's just easier. We talk about expectations around marriage and what an Indian wedding looks like, and what are the expectations around that, and different gender roles that come into play, and how the sort of the family looks in those types of big life-changing events, and what the expectations are. And there isn't a need to say, oh, and we have a 5-day wedding and this is what it looks like and this is what each means, but really there's just this mutual understanding. Oh, you had this, okay, and what did that look like? And I get to actually sit and spend more time talking about the actual issues that are going on,
Right.
as opposed to having a lot of our session be the explaining. I think that's similar even when talking about parental expectation and disappointing of parents. I think there is certainly, a larger, and we sort of talked about that sacrifice that our immigrant parents make. And there is this understanding when I work with other South Asian women that is a piece that has to be navigated. And whatever choices they make are their choice, but it is a factor, and it is a piece. And having that understanding, and a lot of them knowing that, or assuming that I've probably gone through it myself, I think can feel very helpful for them. I'm working with, someone who's dealing with a lot of grief at this time, and just even talking about sort of the different rituals and traditions that happen around death. There isn't this need for me to ask a ton of questions and to understand the pieces, like the prayers and the ceremonies that happen. And so again, there's time to talk about the work.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I wish I could just, well, I couldn't because I'm recorded, but like that snippet is so important. And it's like taking the client having to teach culture, like to do a course on culture in the therapy session. And it's so true. And I even get questions from people who are not in the know, clearly asking, well, why do you need a therapist of color directory? And I'm like, do I take a breath? Do I explain that? Or like, are you someone who's never going to get it? Right. So I think what you just highlighted is so important, and it's so true. And I've heard people say that in many different ways, but it's like, I don't want to have to explain my culture. I just want to come in and talk about the issues, right? Or not feel judgment. Well, why do you have to listen to your parents, right? Like questions that's like, well, like, it's not just about listening, right? But it's that respect for elders, it's the cultural norms that you just have to attend to. Like you said, regardless of what your decision is, there's still a respect for family that you have to navigate.
And they're still needing to understand the context. And so sort of that's like my biggest, I was very heavily trained in the ecological model at Northeastern, and that very much is the framework that I come with when I meet with my clients, is what is the context? What, not only someone is coming into me and saying I'm presenting with, excessive worry, I can't sleep, and naming all these symptoms, but okay, what is the context of that? What does that look like? Why is that happening? And what is influencing those symptoms? And allows me to really treat the person within their context. And I think especially when working with individuals from various cultural backgrounds, it's incredibly important to be able to see all of those factors, as opposed to sort of just treating the symptoms of something. And
Mhm.
that cultural umbrella and knowledge and understanding is super helpful. And I work with other women of color, other women whose families are from Asia. And there is certainly, there's definitely this shared experience that we have. And there's this sort of open dialogue and opportunity to say, I know this happens in other Asian cultures. I know this happens in the Indian culture. Is this what it's like in your Asian culture?
Mhm.
What does that look like?
Mhm.
And so even if
Mhm.
I don't have the exact same cultural background as them, having some similarities and having that shared experience of being a woman of color
Mhm.
can
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
facilitative in the therapy.
Yeah, and powerful for people, right? I just hear time and time again. And, I hear, a woman was sharing with me recently that it took her 8 years to find a woman of color as a therapist, right? It's like, it's really hard. It's really hard out there. So thank you for sharing that. And, I just appreciate the work that you're doing, coming out and being in the field to that, because we do need to increase our numbers. And so anyone listening who's interested in joining the field, we need you. Come on in. It's such a rewarding career too. So I'd love to talk a little
Absolutely.
bit of, yeah, a little bit about, we talk about a personal struggle that you've experienced and how did you navigate that? What were some of the tools that you used to work through the situation?
Yeah. So, something that a difficult experience that honestly continues to be ongoing for me is, I lost my dad a couple of months ago,
Mm,
back in March, and
my sympathy.
thank you.
Mhm,
Um, and he was, very sick for a couple of months and had been getting sick for some time. And the loss of him has been absolutely devastating, and having to navigate that while the rest of life continuing to move forward
mhm,
has been a challenge and a struggle. And it's interesting, something I talk about with my clients day in and day out is about self-care and boundaries,
mhm,
and really kind of listening to your mind and your body.
mhm,
And, I struggled with kind of how to go forward. I was very excited that I just sort of started this practice. Things were going well. I had a wait list. All of the
mhm,
things were moving in the right direction. And here my world just crumbled. And so how do I continue to take care of myself while making
mhm,
sure I'm able to provide what I need, to my clients? And
mhm,
so I, sort of at that time, my course had kind of ended that I was teaching. I didn't take on any more
mhm,
clients. So,
mhm,
I personally kept my caseload on the smaller side. So kind of
mhm,
boundaries. I made sure I scheduled,
mm,
time for self-care.
mhm,
I was working with somebody. I just started working with somebody at that time who was dealing with the loss of a parent. And luckily
mm,
I just had one session, and I kind of looked inward and said, what are my boundaries around this? And I said, hey, I've really enjoyed our one session, and I have this awesome person that I'm going to refer you to who's going to be able to better help you.
mhm,
And so during this time, and when I look, professionally, the way I kind of coped with this loss was, really putting boundaries up, listening to what I
mhm,
could do, keeping my caseload low. I think personally, the way that I've handled this really, really big loss is, you know, finding, you talked about journaling at the very beginning. That's something
mhm,
that's been very helpful to me,
mhm, mhm,
is to journal, and talk about my feelings and talk about, missing my dad and what I miss and things I wish he was here to see and memories that
mhm,
we've had together. I think sort of communicating with people around me when I'm having a hard day. For example, if I'm having a tough day, my husband is very, very always ears open. And so I'm very quick to say, hey, I'm having a tough day today. And so he kind of he always takes over in a lot of ways in our home, but
mhm,
does even
mhm,
more more and goes even further to kind of make sure that I can have the space that I need, especially with our daughter and
Mhm.
responsibilities. And so the journaling, looking to people around me, talking to
Mhm.
people uh,
Mhm.
who are also experiencing this loss, and seeking mental health services myself
Mhm. Mhm.
to cope
Mhm.
with the grief. Even
Mhm.
though, we're therapists and we're psychologists, we also need help, even though we have
Absolutely.
like giant toolboxes. It's really hard to use those tools on ourselves. And so
Mhm.
sometimes we need help
Mhm.
from other people to help us use those tools effectively.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
that's been very helpful for me as
Yeah.
I navigate this loss and experience the very intense grief.
Mhm. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I can, I can tell, I can just feel that it's still painful for you. And I appreciate you sharing the strategies that you're using as well. So, and just naming that, we are people too. We experience different things and we need to access different types of support. So, you talk about boundaries, right? How important that is. And, setting the boundaries for yourself about what's realistic, what's my load, what can I take on? And then having a client who was having a similar issue, you recognize like this is probably not going to be work well for me or for her or for both of us. So
Right.
setting a
I
boundary around that.
ethically treat her in a way that wouldn't have
Hmm.
my own grief, especially since
Yeah.
it's so new to
Hmm.
kind of
Hmm.
be there. Yeah.
Yeah. And we're seeing examples of that with women of color in public settings, like Naomi Osaka and Simone Biles this week really setting a boundary about mental health, right? That's right.
I
Yeah.
loved it. We love them like even more and have even
Hmm.
for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or
You also talked about journaling,
Mhm.
which is really important. And um, I really do, and I am adopted. I have adopted that. It's still a practice, and I'm trying to figure out what my style is. But I just use it, write my thoughts. Sometimes I go back, sometimes I don't. Right, so it's a process that's always evolving. But I think really helpful for me to kind of get out what things are on my mind that I need to just clear my head with.
Yeah, it was an outlet for me to kind of, without any judgment and without having to navigate other people's emotions, because the
Hmm.
people around me are also experiencing grief, but a way for it to just kind of be my
Hmm.
thoughts about me for me. And
Hmm. Hmm.
it's been very powerful and continues to facilitate some of the healing.
Yeah, great. And then you talk about talking, right? I think that's so great to be able to use your community of support and tap in and ask for help. And your husband, being able to step up, and I love it, love when husbands step up.
He's more than does his like
Yeah.
up all the he's
Yeah.
like
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think it's so important for us to share our lived experience as well. I think in how we're raised in psychology, we're often taught or trained to be these blank slates who
good old
seem to
Copa.
have it all figured out, right? We don't have it all figured out all the time,
We're
right?
people
We're
and
people too, yeah, for sure. It's
too.
say that again.
I said, and life happens to us too.
Exactly. And so what a powerful way to be able to share that what we've experienced and then what we do to cope, right? I think that that's the message too. So kind of the last topic I want to turn to is just talking about, I know some of your work within the field. I know you're doing some other consulting. So love to hear a little bit about the other work that you're doing, like that interests you, your passions, and anything that you're doing specifically around healing within communities. I don't know if you're you're on a board or any communities, or what community engagement are you into right now?
Absolutely. So within, I think I mentioned, I work with a South Asian domestic violence organization. And so since January, we're a little bit on a summer break now, but since January, I've been running sort of culturally adaptive DBT skills group.
So you got to tell us what's DBT for people who may not be aware.
So dialectical behavioral therapy, it's a type of therapy that historically has been very helpful in helping individuals suffering from borderline personality disorder, which is a very challenging personality disorder that folks, can have to deal with. However, the skills that are in this type of therapy can really be used everywhere and anywhere. And so the skills are sort of based on 4 models. So we have a model of mindfulness. So we practice really staying in the moment, come up with strategies, have ideas, practice homework, mindfulness. We talk about interpersonal effectiveness, and this is a topic. So basically, how to get what you want out of a relationship, how to get what you need out of somebody, how to be able to say no, how to get what you need while managing sort of the fact that keeping the relationship is important, how to kind of interact with others while getting your needs met and also keeping your self-respect. And so we do a lot of work in that area. And I think a lot of these women who are survivors of domestic violence, this is an area that is very hard for them, and an area that the skills are incredibly sometimes challenging for them. I think from a cultural perspective, sort of asking for what you want, especially as a woman, is very challenging. And so we talk about different ways to be able to do that, and kind of how to be heard while also understanding what the cultural expectations are and what the cultural norms are and what the gender expectations are. And so we talk a lot about that. We talk about emotion regulation, which means kind of how to understand our emotions, how to name them, how to sort of think about our emotions in the context of the situation, and what changes we can make to our emotion, how we can make these changes. And then we talk about general coping skills. And so we meet once a week for 90 minutes, and we review different skills, and the women have homework and they come back with different examples. And it's been really powerful to be a part of that group. A lot of these women feel incredibly isolated. And I think the pandemic has just added a very intense layer of the isolation. And so for women to be able to come together and talk about mental health issues, talk about the fact that they're struggling in a place where they aren't really able to talk about these, in a place that is safe, because oftentimes these women don't have other places to be able to talk about some of these challenges. And so it's been really powerful to see the connections that the women make with each other, and the normalizing of their experiences, I think, has been very healing for them. And so that's that. Like I love doing that on Tuesday evenings. Again, we're on a little bit of a summer break, but that's definitely something I look forward to and really enjoy. And it feels like I'm able to give my time and spend my time with women of color and the marginalized community and population.
Yeah. Thank you. I could see the joy that you gained from that, just in the way you talked about it. And you talked about the cultural adaptation. So can you share a little bit about what are some ways that you make DBT work for the women of color that you serve or support?
I think the biggest piece is around the interpersonal skills and how to communicate with others about what your needs are, while acknowledging and understanding that women, South Asian women, are taught to kind of just be like the anchor for the family, kind of do whatever needs to be done for the family, and kind of prioritize their needs as last, or not prioritize their needs at all. And so kind of having that shift and of thinking has been very helpful, while also acknowledging that it's not easy to be able to do that, acknowledging that, you know, it looks a little bit different to be able to ask for what you need. I think in, you know, traditional DBT, it would be like, you know, somebody asks you to do something, you know, you just say no. Whereas we talk about examples, say you're living in a household with your husband, and you're in a traditional household, and you have in-laws, and your in-laws have these, you know, requests of you, and it's something you don't want to do. How do you sort of navigate that? And women have really struggled with doing that. You know, a woman talked about how she, you know, didn't get to see a family member who she really wanted to see, and ended up losing them because there was no way for her to be able to say, this is what I want and this is what I. And so to acknowledge the struggle of doing that, and kind of the cultural, the idea that it's not really encouraged in the culture for women to speak up and say what they want. And I think that's especially true of sort of the generation before myself.
Right.
And so I think, yeah, acknowledging the cultural nuances, looking at gender and talking about ways in which people can meet sort of the requirements or the cultural needs. And so being creative in the way that they ask for things, or you know, finding ways to negotiate in a way that will allow them to maybe get part of what they need without necessarily rupturing or harming the relationship, or while also maintaining the respect that's expected to be.
Right. And for some of the women, I imagine it's, you know, you're starting at like these baby, even minuscule steps to start to build up there, right? It's
Absolutely. Yeah, and I recently started working with another organization that works with, it's a South Asian workers group, and basically it's about community building for South Asian individuals here in the greater Boston area. And they recently received a grant to do mental health talks as part of it. And so I've been helping them sort of put together the curriculum, and we've been meeting regularly to put together the curriculum, kind of do sort of, you know, our own needs assessment of what's going on. And it's been really unique to work with, there's a couple of sociologists on the panel, and so it's been really nice to work from an interdisciplinary perspective, and to provide my background and sort of my take on mental health and what can be helpful, and the stigma piece. A lot of my dissertation was around stigma and mental health issues for this, and that's actually how we connected.
Nice, great, excellent. So if folks, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I know Shauna put your social media handle there, and do you have a website that we can share with folks too?
It's under construction.
Got you. It's in progress. All right. So we'll be sure to definitely, when that's ready, we'll definitely share that out with folks. This has been such a wonderful conversation, and I just thank and appreciate your vulnerability, your openness to sharing your experiences, and to share the work that you're doing. I especially love hearing about the cultural adaptations that you're doing to DBT for the women that you're working with. This is really, really inspiring. So my last question for you, what is your go-to self-care strategy, that something that you do every day is just like your maintenance thing? What do you do for maintenance self-care?
Maintenance self-care. That is a great question. I think there are times when it changes. I am an incredibly affectionate person, and so my self-care / go-to is lots of hugs and snuggles, and sort of that touch piece. Daughter, husband, dog, all of them when my mom is here. So that's sort of one piece. And I think my other go-to self-care piece would be sort of, I've really gotten into kind of practicing mindful breathing.
Mm,
And so, when I notice things feel stressful or the day feels hard, it's sort of something that I kind of resort to and kind
mhm.
of take a time out for myself. And I think mindful breathing, although it's a learned skill, is something that's easy to do in many different places. And, I could be doing it now and it's not super obvious, right?
Right, right. Yeah.
Um, yes,
Love
that's
it.
also a go-to
Love
skill.
it. Love it. So mindful breathing and snuggles. I love it. Well, thank you again, Dr. Ami Popat-Jain, for being here on this conversation for Thriving Thursdays. Always looking to uplift and elevate the work that these amazing mental health professionals of color are doing in the work to bring healing to our communities. So thank you all for being here. And we will be taking a hiatus from Thriving Thursdays. We'll be back in 2022. So thank you all for your support. And you'll definitely see us. We have lots of other programming going on, but we hope you enjoy the summer and great having you all with us. Thank you.
Thank you. This was so wonderful.